March 6, 1944. 6,000 feet above the frost-covered Brandenburg countryside, where winter's grip still held the German earth in silence. The morning air cut sharp against the canopy of Oberleutnant Hans Wake's Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 as he led his swarm of 4 fighters in a climbing turn toward the formation of American bombers approaching Berlin. The familiar growl of his Daimler-Benz DB605 engine filled the cramped cockpit, its 1,200 horsepower pulling him upward through the thin air. Behind him, 3 more 109s followed in practiced formation, their angular silhouettes dark against the pale March sky. For Wake and his fellow pilots of Jagdgeschwader 300, this was the moment they had trained for, the defense of the Reich's heart against the growing waves of American daylight raiders. In the distance, the drone of hundreds of engines announced the approach of something unprecedented. Nearly 800 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, their aluminum forms glinting in the morning light, pressed onward in their rigid combat boxes. But something was different this day. Flanking the bombers, weaving through the formation with a grace that seemed almost impossible at such altitude, flew sleek single-engine fighters unlike any the German pilots had encountered before. These were not the stubby P-47 Thunderbolts they had grown accustomed to battling over Western Europe, nor were they the familiar silhouettes of Royal Air Force Spitfires. These aircraft possessed an elegant, almost predatory beauty, long-nosed, bubble-canopied fighters that moved through the 25,000-foot air with a fluidity that spoke of aerodynamic perfection. The P-51 Mustang had arrived over Berlin. For 3 years, the Luftwaffe's fighter pilots had held a psychological advantage over Allied forces penetrating deep into German airspace. The mathematics of aerial warfare had favored the defenders. German fighters could intercept, engage, refuel, and return to battle while Allied escorts, operating at the limits of their range, were forced to turn back, leaving the bombers vulnerable for the final approaches to their targets. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, backbone German fighter aviation, had proven its worth in countless engagements. With its tight turning radius, rapid climb rate, and experienced pilots who had learned their craft in the crucible of 4 years of continuous combat, the 109 had maintained air superiority over the Reich's heartland. But the American fighter now approaching Berlin represented something unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare. A machine that could match the performance of German fighters while carrying enough fuel to escort bombers all the way to the Nazi capital and back to bases in England, a round trip of over 1,000 miles. The development of this revolutionary aircraft had begun not in the drawing rooms of American aircraft manufacturers, but in the mind of a British purchasing commission officer named Tommy Hitchcock, who recognized that the war's outcome might well depend on a fighter that could go the distance. The original P-51, powered by the Allison V1710 engine, had shown promise at low altitudes but lacked the high-altitude performance necessary for escort duties over Germany. The breakthrough came when test pilots discovered that mating the Mustang's aerodynamically advanced airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, manufactured under license by Packard as the V1650, created a fighter that could not only match but exceed the performance of any aircraft in the German inventory. The Merlin engine was itself a masterpiece of British engineering, a 12-cylinder, liquid-cooled power plant featuring a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger that maintained peak performance even in the thin air above 25,000 feet. Where the Messerschmitt's Daimler-Benz engine began to lose power as altitude increased, the Merlin-powered Mustang actually improved its performance, generating 1,600 horsepower at optimal altitude and propelling the aircraft to speeds exceeding 430 miles per hour, nearly 50 miles per hour faster than the Bf 109G at comparable altitudes. As Wake's formation closed with the American bombers, he could see the escorting Mustangs positioning themselves with tactical precision. Their pilots, many of whom had cut their teeth in the earlier, desperate days of the bomber offensive, understood that air combat at this altitude was as much about energy management as marksmanship. The P-51's superior speed gave it the luxury of choosing when and where to engage, dictating the terms of combat in a way that frustrated German fighter tactics developed over years of successful interception missions. The first engagement came as Wake dove his 109 toward a formation of B-17s, only to find his attack interrupted by a diving Mustang that had been waiting, invisible against the sun. The American pilot's tactics were unfamiliar. Rather than turning to fight in the traditional manner of aerial combat, the P-51 made a high-speed pass, fired a burst from its 6.50 caliber machine guns, then used its superior speed to climb away before the German pilot could bring his guns to bear. When Wake attempted to pursue, Pulling his stick back and pouring power to his engine, he discovered to his shock that the American fighter was pulling away from him, climbing at an angle his 109 could not match. This was not the aerial warfare Wake had learned in training, nor was it the combat he had experienced in 3 years of fighter operations. The Americans were using their aircraft's superior performance to fight a different kind of battle. One based on speed and altitude advantage, rather than the turning dogfights that had characterized air combat since the war's beginning. Each time a German pilot attempted to engage, the Mustangs would accelerate away, climb to a higher altitude, then dive back down for another attack, using their energy advantage to control the tempo of combat. For the Luftwaffe pilots, this first encounter with Mustangs over Berlin was a revelation that struck at the core of their understanding of aerial warfare. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, which had dominated European skies since 1939, suddenly found itself outclassed not just in speed but in the fundamental calculus of air combat. The German pilots had expected to face the familiar challenges of engaging enemy bombers, calculating interception courses, coordinating attacks through defensive crossfire, managing ammunition and fuel for multiple engagement cycles. Instead, they discovered that the enemy escort fighters could match their climb rate, exceed their speed, and most devastatingly, remain on station throughout the entire mission. The statistics of that first Berlin escort mission told a story that would reshape the war's trajectory. Of the more than 70 German fighters that rose to intercept the American formation, fewer than half successfully engaged the bombers. The Mustangs claimed 23 German aircraft destroyed, while losing only 11 of their own number. A kill ratio that demonstrated not just superior equipment, but superior tactics adapted to exploit that equipment's advantages. More significantly, the bomber losses were dramatically reduced compared to previous long-range missions, validating the strategic concept that had driven the Mustang's development. But beyond the numbers lay a psychological impact that resonated through the German fighter force. Pilots who had grown accustomed to fighting on favorable terms, close to home bases, with the ability to disengage and return to combat, now faced an enemy that could sustain operations throughout the mission duration. The comfortable assumption that Allied fighters would eventually be forced to turn back, leaving the bombers vulnerable, had been shattered by the appearance of a machine that carried 485 gallons of internal fuel plus external drop tanks that extended its range even further. The Mustang's fuel capacity represented more than just tactical advantage. It embodied the industrial might of American manufacturing, which by 1944 was producing aircraft at a rate that dwarfed German output. While Messerschmitt factories struggled to manufacture 300 109s per month under increasingly difficult conditions, North American Aviation's plants in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, were turning out P-51s at a rate of 500 aircraft monthly. Each Mustang carried enough fuel for missions that German pilots could barely comprehend, flights of 7 hours or more, covering distances that required 4 separate fuel stops for comparable German operations. The engine that powered this revolutionary capability had its own symbolic significance. The Packard V1650 Merlin, built in American factories under license from Rolls-Royce, represented the marriage of British engineering excellence with American mass production capability. Each engine required over 2,000 individual parts, machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, yet Packard's production lines were delivering completed power plants at a rate of 1 every 45 minutes by early 1944. This industrial capacity meant that damaged engines could be quickly replaced, while German pilots faced increasingly long delays for major repairs as their manufacturing infrastructure crumbled under Allied bombing. As the aerial battle over Berlin progressed through that March morning, German pilots began to recognize that they were witnessing not just the arrival of a superior fighter aircraft, but the manifestation of an entirely different approach to warfare. The Americans had solved the fundamental problem of strategic bombing, the inability to provide continuous fighter escort to distant targets, through technological innovation backed by massive industrial investment. The Mustang represented the integration of aerodynamic advancement, power plant development, and manufacturing capacity in service of a strategic vision that German war planning had never anticipated. Hauptmann Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's general of fighters, would later describe the psychological impact of that first Mustang appearance over Berlin with characteristic directness. The moment German pilots realized that American fighters could now operate over the Reich's capital with the same effectiveness they had previously demonstrated only over France and the Low Countries, The strategic balance of the air war shifted irrevocably. The Luftwaffe's doctrine of dispersed defense, based on the assumption that distance would eventually favor the defenders, had been rendered obsolete by an aircraft that could accompany bombers to any target in Europe and return to base with fuel to spare. The technical superiority that allowed this strategic revolution was built into every aspect of the Mustang's design. Its laminar flow wing, developed through extensive wind tunnel testing, reduced drag to a degree that German engineers had thought impossible in a fighter aircraft. The careful attention to detail in areas as mundane as cooling system design and propeller efficiency translated into performance advantages that accumulated across the mission profile. Where the Bf-109 lost effectiveness as altitude increased, the P-51 maintained peak performance up to 30,000 feet, giving it the ability to fight effectively at altitudes where German fighters struggled to operate. But perhaps most significantly, the Mustang's performance envelope matched the operating requirements of American strategic bombing doctrine in a way that no previous fighter had achieved. The B-17 and B-24 bombers performed optimally at altitudes between 25 and 30,000 feet, exactly the range where the Merlin-powered Mustang delivered its best performance. This synchronization meant that escort fighters could remain with their charges throughout the bomb run, engaging German interceptors at the precise moment when bombers were most vulnerable. During the straight and level approach to target, the appearance of Mustangs over Berlin also marked the maturation of American pilot training programs that had been expanding rapidly since 1942. The pilots flying those first escort missions brought with them hundreds of hours of flight training, including advanced courses in high-altitude operations, formation flying, and air-to-air gunnery. Many had gained combat experience in earlier operations over North Africa or in the Pacific theater, providing them with tactical knowledge that complemented their aircraft's technical advantages. This combination of superior equipment and well-trained personnel created a multiplicative effect that German defenders found increasingly difficult to counter. The sound of Merlin engines over Berlin carried with it the promise of American industrial capacity applied without limit to the conduct of warfare. Each Mustang represented not just an individual aircraft but an entire production system. Aluminum smelters in the Pacific Northwest, precision machine shops in Detroit, engine assembly lines in Ohio, and flight training schools across the American Midwest. This industrial ecosystem could sustain losses and replace equipment at rates that made continuous operations possible, while German manufacturing, increasingly disrupted by bombing and raw material shortages, struggled to maintain even reduced production schedules. For the German pilots returning to their bases after that first encounter with Mustangs over Berlin, the implications were clear, even if not yet fully articulated. The aircraft they had just faced represented not merely an incremental improvement in Allied capabilities, but a fundamental shift in the strategic balance. The comfortable assumption that geography favored the defense, that distance would eventually force enemy fighters to turn back, had been invalidated by an aircraft that carried the battle to the heart of the Reich and maintained air superiority throughout the engagement. The ripple effects of this technological and strategic shift extended beyond the immediate tactical situation. German aircraft designers, who had focused on maximizing performance at the expense of range, suddenly found themselves trying to develop responses to capabilities they had not anticipated. The Focke-Wulf Tu-152 Messerschmitt Bf Tu-62 and other advanced German fighters under development incorporated lessons learned from encounters with Mustangs. But these aircraft would arrive too late, and in too few numbers, to alter the war's trajectory. In the months following that first Berlin escort mission, the pattern established on March 6, 1944, would repeat with increasing frequency and devastating effect. American bombers, protected by Mustang escorts, would penetrate German airspace with virtual impunity, striking targets throughout the Reich, while German fighter forces, despite desperate efforts and occasional tactical successes, found themselves gradually worn down by attrition they could not sustain. The Mustang's ability to maintain air superiority over Germany had broken the back of the Luftwaffe's defensive strategy, creating the conditions for the sustained bombing campaign that would cripple German war production and morale. The symbolic weight of Mustangs over Berlin was not lost on German leadership. Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, reportedly observed that seeing enemy fighters over the Reich's capital marked the end of German hopes for victory in the air war. The statement reflected not just the immediate tactical implications, but the broader strategic reality that American industrial capacity, focused through technological innovation, had produced capabilities that German war production could neither match nor counter effectively. Yet perhaps the most profound impact of the Mustang's arrival over Berlin was psychological. The demonstration to German pilots, ground crews, and civilian observers that the Luftwaffe could no longer protect the homeland's skies. The confidence that had sustained German aerial operations through 4 years of increasingly difficult combat began to erode as pilots returned from missions with reports of American fighters that could outfight, outrun, and outlast anything in the German inventory. This psychological dimension of the air war, as important as the tactical considerations, marked the beginning of the Luftwaffe's transformation from an offensive force capable of supporting German strategic objectives to a defensive organization focused merely on survival. The technological revolution represented by the P-51 Mustang over Berlin embodied the fundamental differences between American and German approaches to warfare by 1944. Where German engineering had pursued maximum performance through specialized, complex designs that were difficult to manufacture and maintain, American engineering had achieved superior results through careful integration of proven technologies optimized for mass production. The Mustang's success lay not in revolutionary breakthroughs but in the systematic application of aerodynamic knowledge, power plant development, and manufacturing techniques to create an aircraft that exceeded the sum of its parts. As spring progressed into summer 1944, the sight of Mustangs over German cities became commonplace, a silver harbinger of destruction that arrived with mechanical precision day after day. German pilots learned to recognize the distinctive engine note of the Merlin power plant, the particular way sunlight reflected off the Mustang's polished aluminum skin, and the tactical formations that maximized the aircraft's performance advantages. These observations became survival skills as the air war's balance shifted irrevocably in favor of the Americans and their seemingly inexhaustible supply of superior aircraft and well-trained pilots. The Mustang's fuel tanks, each one capable of carrying enough gasoline to propel the aircraft for hundreds of miles, became symbols of American abundance in a conflict increasingly characterized by German scarcity. While Luftwaffe operations were constrained by chronic fuel shortages that limited training flights and operational sorties, American fighters appeared over Europe with fuel to spare, conducting extended combat air patrols and ground attack missions that demonstrated the vast industrial capacity supporting Allied operations. Each gallon of aviation gasoline in a Mustang's tanks represented American oil production, refining capacity, and transportation systems that dwarfed anything available to the German war effort. The strategic implications of this fuel abundance extended beyond immediate tactical considerations. American pilots could afford to use their aircraft's performance advantages aggressively, climbing to intercept German formations, engaging in extended combat, and pursuing retreating enemies without concern for fuel conservation. German pilots, operating under increasingly strict fuel limitations, found themselves unable to sustain prolonged engagements or maintain the patrol patterns necessary for effective defense. The psychological pressure of fuel constraints added another dimension to the stress of combat, as German pilots calculated fuel consumption against tactical requirements in ways their opponents never needed to consider. In the cockpits of their Messerschmitt fighters, German pilots experienced a gradual recognition that they were fighting not just superior aircraft, but the manifestation of an industrial and technological system they could not match. Each encounter with Mustangs reinforced the reality that American manufacturing was producing fighters faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them, while German aircraft production, despite heroic efforts under increasingly difficult conditions, could not replace losses at sustainable rates. This mathematical reality, as much as any tactical consideration, shaped the psychological environment in which German pilots conducted operations. The Mustang's 6.50 caliber machine guns, fed by ammunition loads totaling more than 2,000 rounds, provided another demonstration of American industrial capacity applied to combat effectiveness. Each gun represented precision manufacturing techniques that could produce thousands of identical weapons, while the ammunition carried sufficient explosive content to destroy enemy aircraft with relatively few hits. German pilots, accustomed to the devastating punch of their aircraft's 20 mm and 30 mm cannon, discovered that the Mustang's rifle-caliber weapons, when concentrated in massed formations, could deliver volumes of fire that overwhelmed individual targets through sheer quantity rather than individual projectile effectiveness. The winter of 1944-45 brought with it a new phase of the air war over Germany, as Mustang-escorted bomber formations appeared over German cities with increasing frequency and devastating effect. German pilots, those who survived the increasingly lethal encounters with American fighters, reported aircraft that seemed to improve with each engagement, better coordinated tactics, more experienced pilots, and technical modifications that enhanced performance even further. The P-51D variant that appeared in large numbers during this period featured a bubble canopy that provided superior visibility, uprated engines that delivered even greater high-altitude performance, and increased ammunition capacity that extended combat effectiveness. By the spring of 1945, the sight of Mustangs over German airspace had become so routine that Luftwaffe operations were planned around the assumption of American air superiority rather than any realistic hope of challenging it effectively. German fighter pilots who had once approached combat with confidence born of superior training and proven aircraft now flew defensive missions designed primarily to survive rather than to achieve tactical objectives. The transformation of the air war's psychological dimension was complete. American fighters over Germany represented not a temporary tactical problem, but a permanent strategic reality that would persist until the war's end. The technical mastery represented by the P-51 Mustang's performance over Europe embodied broader themes of American industrial democracy applied to the conduct of warfare. The aircraft's development had required coordination between civilian contractors, military requirements specialists, British technical advisors, and American manufacturing organizations on a scale that demonstrated the Allied nations' ability to integrate resources across national boundaries in service of common objectives. This collaborative approach to weapons development contrasted sharply with German practices, which increasingly emphasized secrecy and competition between rival organizations rather than systematic cooperation. The Mustang's operational success also validated American training philosophies that emphasized standardized procedures, systematic skill development, and the integration of individual capabilities within larger organizational structures. American pilots flying P-51s over Germany brought with them not just superior aircraft but doctrine and tactics developed through extensive analysis of combat experience and continuous refinement of operational procedures. This systematic approach to military aviation contrasted with German practices that relied increasingly on individual pilot skill and improvisation as institutional knowledge was lost through attrition and organizational disruption. As the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion, the P-51 Mustang over German skies had become more than just a superior fighter aircraft. It represented the triumph of systematic industrial development over improvised responses to technological challenges. The sight of American fighters operating with impunity over the Reich's heartland demonstrated that superior equipment, properly applied through sound doctrine and supported by adequate industrial capacity, could overcome even the most determined and skillful resistance. For German pilots who had witnessed this transformation, the lesson was clear. Warfare in the modern era would be decided not just by courage and skill, but by the ability to mobilize industrial resources in service of technological superiority. The legacy of those first Mustangs over Berlin extends beyond the immediate tactical and strategic implications of their appearance. The aircraft represented a new paradigm in military aviation, the integration of range, performance, and firepower in a package that could be manufactured in quantities sufficient to achieve strategic objectives. This approach to weapons development, emphasizing practical effectiveness over theoretical maximum performance, would influence military aircraft design for decades following the war's end. In the final analysis, the German pilots' inability to believe how P-51 Mustangs outpaced their Mi-109s reflected not just the tactical surprise of encountering superior performance, but the broader shock of confronting an enemy whose industrial and technological capabilities exceeded their own understanding of what was possible. The Mustang over Berlin was more than an aircraft. It was American democracy and industrial might made manifest in aluminum and steel, powered by engines that embodied the marriage of British engineering excellence with American manufacturing capacity, and flown by pilots trained in systems that valued competence over ideology. Against such capabilities, individual courage and tactical skill, however admirable, proved insufficient to alter the war's trajectory. The age of industrial warfare had arrived over German skies, and the P-51 Mustang was its herald.